Hello, everybody. Good evening, and welcome to the first event of the Public Occasion Agency. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I would like to ask you to switch off your mobile phone, and I'd like to say a few words about this event series, the Public Occasion Agency. The Public Occasion Agency is a new initiative for self-determining framework for a public program here at the AA. It's been established by Scrap Marshall sitting here at the front and myself, and will comprise of 4 events per term. This term we have decided to focus on a kind of social goals looking at the city. So we have 4 events scheduled this term, of which one unfortunately has been cancelled. So the event for this Thursday has been cancelled. Further, in March we will have an image-based reading of the city through the works of Exactitudes, a photographic couple from Rotterdam, which correlates with an exhibition in the bar. On the 10th of March we'll have a debate on participatory architectural strategies in South America, and tonight we will have Ian Sinclair. Ian is a Hackney-based writer, and his early writing, notably Ludheath and Whitechapel, was rooted in his adopted home of East London. It did much to popularize the ideas of psychogeography in Britain, and inspired such work as Peter Ackroyd's Hawksmoor and Alan Moore's From Hell. For Ian Sinclair, walking seems to be an essential mode of production. His non-fiction, Lights Out of the Territory from 1997, is based around a series of walks through some of the darker corners of London. Ian has also walked M25, which led to the book London Orbital and the film with the same name. So the kind of observations and commentary that Ian makes on the city, such as evident in the new published Hackney book, which will be for sale after this, after his talk, were the reason for us to think that it might be a good idea to have Ian talk to a room of architects. When we asked Ian what he wanted to talk about, he said, "I will decide on the spot, so at least it will be current." So please join me in welcoming Ian Sinclair to the AA.
Thank you. That very much is the case, I'm afraid, is that my sense is of this as a, although I'm going to be doing most of the talking, it's like a kind of ancient mariner bore in the corner of a pub who's caught you for a bit. I hope it's going to evolve into a dialogue. I grew up with this theory which was put up by an American poet called Charles Olson, whose anniversary happens to be this year, who had taught at Black Mountain College, and that was always in North Carolina. This was a place that haunted me, because partly it was in a state when he was there as rector in the early 50s of total collapse, which is always interesting, partly because it had this amazing mix of people from Bauhaus who were fleeing from Germany, austere modernist designers, people like Albers, the abstract expressionist painters, filmmakers like Arthur Penn, who made Bonnie and Clyde, a bunch of really renegade poets and academics, Buckminster Fuller. All the disciplines were there in a fairly remote place in the country that had no economic base, was full of vibrant ideas, and the poets were proposing a notion, which is what I'm trying to pitch now, of what they called open field poetics, which was that instead of those closed lyric forms where everything was disciplined, everything was sealed off, everything was its own occasion, there is a way of looking at the city, there's a way of looking at the world that is completely open. And when you're composing, therefore, in the way that the Hackney book was done, you include documentation. You go out and interview a lot of people, but you feel free to use this information that comes in and to lift it into a kind of inspiration to use your own imagination, to go off at tangents, and to therefore create a kind of richer form of identity. So in Olson's great major work, which was a series of poems called the Maximus Poems, based on the fishing town of Gloucester, Massachusetts, what he's doing, and his other poems that were interestingly, in the context of where we are now, were called The Archaeologist of Mourning. He saw himself as a kind of architect of language. That he's in a seaside fishing town, a small one but an important one. He's looking at the records, the economic records of how this place grew up, where it came from, what were the quantities of fish, what happened to the men who went out on the sea. He's looking at the geology. He's looking at the Atlantic Ocean and seeing the ridges and the mountains that are beneath it. He's looking west across America and seeing west as being the great thing, and seeing, in fact, novels like Moby Dick in this pursuit of the mad whale across the Atlantic, this insane pursuit, as echoed into the push into the American West, going into the unknown, making the structures that you need to build to live in this landscape. All of this becomes part of one pattern. But at the end of it all, it opens out back into cosmology. He goes back further than Ezra Pound went in the Cantos. He goes back to the beginnings of men scratching out cities, making marks in the stone, the Mayans, the Sumerians, the original ziggurats. All of that becomes part of this poem, and it opens out into what he calls the cosmology of space, into the curvature of the universe, which he sees as love. So it comes back in the end to human emotion. So that's where I am. The city is a human entity. The city is an organic entity, and there's no images here. Now, there's a reason why there's no images here, apart from me being Luddite and completely technically incompetent. Not very long ago, a couple of months ago, in Bloomsbury, I did another talk, and it was an Olympic seminar. We were there. Everybody, apart from me, was in some way connected with the Olympic project. They were architects, they were planners, they were parts of ODA, whatever they were. There were 5 or 6 people. Now, the instruction was that they were to speak for 10 minutes each, because this was an hour or something. An hour and a bit was all that was allowed to us. But each of them, apart from me, had a laptop program. This was what they had. This was the speech. It was up there. And it couldn't be edited. It was a 30-minute, 40-minute pitch. It could not come to 10 minutes. It can't work in real time. So chaos occurred. The kind of images were scrambled. The people were in a state of complete panic. And the other thing that became extremely obvious was that they all had the same images. They were all telling different stories. But if you're talking about the Olympic Park, there is nothing there. So all you've got are these virtual images, which are the same. They're pooled, they're shared. They are of a city that doesn't exist and never will exist, because lots of it has been scaled down, lots of it has been cancelled. But it is a kind of upbeat story. And in the discussion I was having with Jan before this, and I think he told me he was working as a project on the idea of the edgelands, and that this part of the Lower Lea Valley, where the Olympics are developing, was certainly very, very important to the boroughs around it as a kind of edgeland. It represented the equivalent of Charles Olson's Wild West. It was the Wild East, and what it was a place of the second industrial revolution. People who invented plastics. There were all the dirty, ugly, filthy industries were there, but at the same time there was this rather beautiful marshland. There were lammas lands. There were lands that were free for people to graze on. There were the bomb sites of London, where they took the rubble from the war and created Hackney Marshes football pitches. So there were all of these strange things all on top of each other in a kind of illegitimate landscape that represented the edge of our thinking, and therefore it was up for grabs. It was not a narrated landscape. So what happens when it's suddenly enclosed? It's like the agricultural enclosures. One morning you go out, and the thing has now no longer an edge, it's an island. So where does the edge go? Where does this go? It floats off somewhere else. And people are deeply psychologically disturbed by this, in a sense, that something they've been able to see to the horizon for a very long time, it can't be done. There's a blue fence of a certain height. And after a period of time, that blue fence is covered with these computer-generated images that are the perfect version of the future. They are the stadia. They are people that exist nowhere except in cyberspace, smiling and walking like Moonies through fields of daffodils down a perfect parkland. And the announcement is that at the end of all this, when you've suffered all this stuff for so many years, we will be given back the great new London Park. Well, what was there to start with? Exactly what they're giving back to you in a kind of debased form at a cost of billions of pounds. If they'd said, look, this is all about a huge development, we really need to put a massive post-architectural structure called Westfield, a gigantic mall in Stratford, that is the future, and we would like to do some housing, we'd like to do some regeneration, that would be one story, but it's not that. There is this kind of level of public bullshit and dissimulation from above with nobody really knowing what anybody else is doing. And all of the things that are promised were all there to start with. There was this amazing island within the island called Manor Garden Allotments. It was absolutely perfect in terms of what the promise is. There was a community of people there of every race and culture that would never have got together otherwise, reclaiming poisoned soil over generations, 100 years, given to the people as a gift. They built, as architecture, these are the most exciting structures that I've come across. The huts they built were created out of detritus and rubble. You know, if some of them had been presented in an art context, they would have walked away with the Turner Prize. I actually met an old Polish gentleman who'd been there, who'd come at the time of the war, and he spoke about these back rivers around the Lea, and he said that what he did was to scavenge through the winter for bits of plank and bric-a-brac that came ashore, and he would make some kind of craft, a boat, and he would then sail this around these things, doing some fishing and scavenging, and live there, so he'd never had to pay any council tax or anything. And finally, when the boat was too wrecked, he'd pull it ashore and make some sort of hut out of the same material, which I think was exactly a project that did in fact get the Turner Prize. But these things are happening anyway. And the supreme irony that happens here with this thing is that at the end of this, when I went to the meeting in the Manor Gardens, when the people were making the pitch to say, look, we're doing everything that you want, why can't we just be incorporated? We're on the edge of the Olympic Park. Why can't we be incorporated into it as part of the structure? And therefore a demonstration that all of these things you're talking about can become part of the remit of the Olympics. The guy in charge, who's now had to stand down, he was an Irishman, a sort of corporate schmoozer who was there standing under a huge umbrella in his sort of pinstripe suit. Unfortunately, I think, is it 20 or 40 million pounds has gone astray in the meanwhile, unaccounted for, or was it 400? I can't remember, some huge amount. Anyway, he's gone now, taken gardening leave, ironically. But what he said was that, you know, I'm letting them make the pitch, but nothing is going to happen because this is going to be the biggest security operation that London, or Europe indeed, has ever seen, to defend this island that's created. And we need to do that because this needs defending. But they've actually created the structure that required the defense. And now if you go around there are these quite benevolent, but people you wouldn't want to cross are the guards. They're the Gurkhas. Joanna Lumley has won her campaign to get the Gurkhas here, and now the Gurkhas are being employed to defend this island of the Olympic Park. Very, very strange, kind of surreal times. And the more I researched this, the more weird it got, because what I discovered was that in Victorian times they had actually had very exciting international games in which some Native American Indians came over and ran against Cockney champions, and it all took place in a running track right in Hackney Wick. It just happened in the back of somebody's pub. He just built it, and he used the railway embankments as his stadia. He put up grandstand around that. Thousands of people came from all over London. It cost nothing. It was deeply exciting. It expanded into Victoria Park. Races happened there. Nobody paid a penny for it. Christians from Eton College and other places, Cambridge colleges, feeling concerned about the poverty of the East End and so on, created many of these missions, like the Eton Mission, which is there. and they bought land and gave it, which was used for football pitches, athletic pitches, cycle tracks, all of the stuff that had to be destroyed to create this Grand Olympic project. They put boat houses where the kind of tradition of rowing grew up, and in fact the oldest man who had survived the First World War was brought back there to this landscape because the kind of vision of his childhood was that, or when he was a very young man, was that he'd learnt to row on the River Lea, and he went back there and found that everything had been totally obliterated, and they couldn't actually have the kayaking events they wanted to have because the Lea at that point is radioactive. Because of all this industrial damage that was done in this sort of grisly period was reasonable. I mean, there has to be done somewhere. It was done there, and there was a factory making luminous watch dials. And in the 1960s, they dumped all of this radioactive material in sealed drums into cesspits that became part of the Clays Lane development, a development which, and it was inert while it wasn't touched. But when the huge building and churning and digging started to happen, then material from that thorium leached into the water table, which is now radioactive. 12,500 tons of radioactive material have been taken off the Olympic site, but it can't actually be removed because it's too dangerous and expensive to sort of have convoys carrying it across England to the official site, so it's actually buried in a deep cell beneath the site. So you're creating a very weird environment. And around it is all this stuff which I can only describe as post-architectural. I mean, you can't... I think that you're getting to a kind of architecture where the client can just look at a screen. It's like going to a plastic surgeon or some sort of upmarket hairdresser. So I'd like a bit of a wave there, a bit of a thing here, and or just nothing, just a box. And if there's a kind of uglier structure than this Westfield box, I haven't seen it. It's just an amazing slab enclosing a hangar, which is this sort of utilitarian shape. And the outwash of this is seriously bad architecture that slips into the contingent boroughs and erases history. I mean, I'm very concerned about Dalston, in particular Dalston Lane, which was a passageway, a path through a particular part of Hackney. And there had to be created a transport slab, a great slab of concrete, to provide a bus turning point to go to the Olympic site, because it was thought to be inadequate transport. So to do that, you meant demolishing a building called Labyrinth in its last... Well, what this building was, it began as a Victorian circus, became a music hall, became the most state-of-the-art electrified cinema in the 1920s, and therefore a cultural destination, bringing people into this area by the railways which were there by that time, right alongside the railway. And you see photographs of this street as a really thriving place, a lot of small shops, a lot of small businesses that incorporate the earlier Georgian terraces. They're all part of it. Nothing is sort of destroyed, everything is adapted. And the building, this great hangar, then becomes a famous sort of black R&B venue called Four Aces, where all kinds of stuff is first seen in London. Dissolves through to be called in its last phase Labyrinth at the time of the ecstasy culture, the rave culture, and then is vandalized, there's no other word for it, by people who destroy the internal fabric of the building so that it can be a case for being demolished. And in that last period, it's very interesting, kind of squatters come in and take it over and are prepared to fight to keep this space. And all kinds of proposals are made by local architects to keep the building as an entity, to adapt it, to change it, to use it organically as part of the city. And that can't happen because you're up against a kind of monolithic structure that has to produce these Barratt homes. And to do it, you avoid all of the regulations that went there for building these kind of buildings. They're too close together, they come too close to the road, And the end product, so they say, is a new concept which I hadn't heard before, which is called pedestrian permeability, which means that as you come out of your great block of Barrett stuff with no light and kind of airless, lightless little squares where apparently you're supposed to play table tennis, but the gales, the microclimate creates this wind that howls through. You throw up a table tennis ball, it's going to end in Islington. Where you come out of this station and you're not allowed just to drift off in the sense of a flaneur or a wanderer in the city. You go through a kind of created tunnel that drops you into a new shopping mall, which is a little way ahead, and is meant blasting through an arts and crafts building and destroying a whole tranche of Ridley Road Market, which is a street market, kind of anarchic street market with all that goes with that, and all of the kind of freedom and movement of the city to create this generic mall. And the idea is, therefore, the connections that are being made between blocks and shopping entities. And the other big development package is Tesco's, in Mare Street, where there is a huge Tesco's, but which will expand to include housing, so that housing becomes a part of shopping, or an adjunct of shopping, until in the end Hackney is a sort of suburb of Tesco's. In the way that, talking of edgelands, J.G. Ballard always reckoned that the interesting part was the territory around Heathrow, that around the great airports is the area where you see the culture laying itself out into retail. Am I standing on something? Sort of strange click. So I'm bashing that. Okay, I keep still. That you create a new city around an airport, and the old city is not of interest anymore, and therefore London becomes the suburb of Heathrow, and Heathrow needs to expand and expand and expand. And of course Ballard really kind of loved as architectural space or as art space places like the atrium of the Hilton Hotel at Heathrow, which could be anything and everywhere. It could be in California, or it could be in London, it could be in Athens, could be in Berlin. They are unified. There is this endless process of becoming the same thing. I wrote a book which dealt with some of these things. I'm banging away still, I can tell, called Hackney That Rose-Red Empire. And as a piece of architecture, I was very drawn to a building in Hackney called the German Hospital. And what it was a sort of act of patronage that some Germans created this rather beautiful sort of classical Dutch-German looking building with brickwork and lovely lines and gardens in front of it. For people like the sugar workers in Whitechapel, there was a huge German community. They were not necessarily wealthy Germans, they were quite poor Germans, and they would have this hospital available to them, which operated on a kind of philosophical principles that weren't normal in England. That they created fresh air courts, and they divided up the different wards, that the kind of notion of germs as a miasma would not pass from one area to another. But at the end of all this, on the bit that's now Facet Square, which is the model for EastEnders, there is a different kind of building, a 1930s building, which was put in much later, and was the nurses' home for the hospital. And now, in a sort of fairly standard urban conversion, this building has become flats, and yet the proportions of the flats, the crystal windows of the 1930s details, the wide corridors, the light, the flat roof that suddenly throws you into a whole vision of the city. I mean, all of that seems to me admirable and pleasant, and if you can get in there, that's fine. And in the book, fictionally and based on actually, I did go into that building, and I just kind of read a little bit about that. Alice lived with her boyfriend, a practicing sound poet and dub technician, in what had once been the nurses' quarters. Fresh air, light, space, The architect's ideals were in sympathy with the whims and desires of the newcomers, the retro-aesthetic colonists of Dalston. This was a boat building, a landlocked liner, with curved metal rails, balustrades and wide decks. The tall windows with their beveled hinges were original, cantilevered, the boyfriend said, steel frames like Crittall windows, and he pointed out the maternity wing and the sunroom bellying out from the north wall. There were cream corridors broad enough to push 2 gurneys in opposite directions. There was a Mondrian grid of window panel reflections, and everywhere, at every turn as you climbed the stairs, there were views. The warm red brick of the older hospital blocks, the curtains of greenery, the townscape of Hackney kept at a polite distance as a playful backdrop and not a threatening reality. When we paused to admire the circular balconies and sun decks and the gardens below, I found myself staring back into the much smaller windows of the Flemish blocks with their scarlet shutters. What memory traces were imprinted on glass, this model of what a hospital should be, roomy, clean, uncluttered. It gave itself up without a struggle to develop by Anne Currell, a hotshot local estate agent and reimaginer, the one who puts personalized letters through the door. Well, the interesting thing about these hospitals is that they become, within the city, reservoirs of memory, even though they're right under threat as buildings. When I was doing the earlier books, like Whitechapel, Scarlet Tracy and so on, the place I got all my information out of was the London Hospital in Whitechapel, because there, within the archive, they had incredible photographs that went right back, from the original X-ray machines to all of the patients who'd come there. It was an enormous social record that's kept within a hospital, which is where you'd not expect to find it. And there were maps and drawings and all kinds of things. And when I looked into the German hospital in Hackney, what I discovered was that Joseph Conrad, who was someone I was very interested in, had come back there when he'd had his complete collapse in the Congo and was feverish and malarial and completely broken down, came back with his notebooks, his photographs and so on to the German hospital, where he began to construct the piece that became Heart of Darkness. So the Heart of Darkness, which has brought back this kind of colonial nightmare of Africa, is earthed down in Hackney at the same time as people who lived in Graham Road just outside that hospital. There's a record of a woman who loses her job as a machinist and is too ashamed to admit it and to seek work, and so stays at home and literally starves to death. So the Heart of Darkness is there. And I think when you adapt these buildings, you have to be aware of the history that's there. There was a filmmaker and a photographer too, I think, were both caught up in this same notion that I've had, the sense of the importance of buildings that survive as markers, and how tactful you have to be when you deal with them. And they did a project that I heard about, which was that they found archival photographs of operating theatres, and in the later times this hospital had been an asylum. They found the photographs of the wards, and they went round to the flats of the newcomers who had come in, and they showed them these photographs and asked permission to photograph them now, incomers, against what was there before. And some of them were very interested. They thought that, well, here we are, this is what was here, this is interesting, let's confront it, let's present ourselves. And others were deeply disturbed by this idea, which they did not want to know about. They did not want that. They did not want that to be part of the story. They wanted to be stepping fresh into a space which had a kind of atmosphere but no history. And that's a difficult thing to do. Like, what do you do about all of the great asylums that mark the perimeter, talking about edges and borders again? When I was walking around London for the M25 project, of walking around to define where the city stopped, what was the edge of London, I discovered that all of the great hospitals like Shenley and Claybury and so on, massive entities that had been constructed in this fairly brutal style often, but with these Italianate water towers, to give respite to the damage to the city. The most disturbed people from the ghettos of the city were pushed out to the fringe, in the way that Foucault talks about removing the diseased entities of the city and shoving them out to the edge, out of sight, out of mind, making for very, very difficult journeys for their relations to get there, to see them. All of that was out there, and all of that disappeared in the kind of first flavour of New Labour, was gone. And what was put in their place was a makeover into gated communities, more of these islands that are there everywhere, more sealed off spaces with no history. So you make them over, you work on that process to take these interesting architectural spaces and to make something else of them. I suppose most notably one down in Surrey, Royal Holloway I saw, which was like the interior of a Turkish bath. It was quite stunning, and the people there were extremely wealthy and were generally there because of its convenience to Heathrow, so they could get out. So they would never actually need to be in England as such, but they would have a place to be that was near the airport. And the chapel, which was a room with hammer beam ceilings and so on, had been turned into a swimming pool. So the chapel was a basketball court, and the dining hall was turned into a kind of swimming pool. So everything had these strange double identities, which nobody could live with, but which they had to confront. So I invented an architect. It's not an invention, it's a kind of combination of various architects I really did meet for this book, and I put her into this building, the German hospital. And I'll just read you a little bit about that, and show what it was like on the roof too, to introduce her. Alice's partner leant on the rail. This is a flat roof where you suddenly understand, unless you have these spaces in buildings, you don't see the panorama. And I think this is the whole thing with architecture, not to the concentration on the single entity, but to see that the entity is part of a panoramic view. It's very important to know the rest of the story. And if you have these flat roofs, and in this case there was a flat that actually opened out onto the roof, you saw that Hackney was like a very green space. There were a lot of parks. It was like looking down into some beautiful graveyard like Abney Park, as if there was all of these trees, all of this greenery, churches emerging from it, and houses like gravestones, like memorials running right down to the edge of the city. So it's all there, and it's important to be able to see that and to have this roof as a communal space. Alice's partner leant on the rail, smoking contemplatively and reading the Hackney landscape and speculating on its confusing perspectives, how Mare Street appears so far away, clots of green swallowing up tight terraces and sharply angled roofs. The young men knew nothing about the Labyrinth Club, the demolished theatre, but he did know something. A friend of Alice's who boasted of being a regular at the height of the rave era. He would give her a call and see if she was in. Her name was Anya Gree, the architect, the one who had a show recently at the Pumping House in Wapping. She wanted to meet me because she had an Olympic project she wanted to discuss. It was her way of retaining the Lower Lea Valley as a virtual world wilderness, and by folding estates and stadiums back into the earth before they emerged, allowing the whole frantic business to happen in the head as a hallucination of choice, while the actual ground remained inviolate. Anya found the tunnels, the dub poet said, running from Facet Square to the junction and connecting to a rail system. It's something nuclear, she thinks. Well, I think this was a very kind of interesting concept this woman had, and I did hear it from somebody. This idea that not only the emerging reality architecture is presented in a virtual form, but that the city of the imagination, in a way that it's always been there through people like Blake or Wyndham Lewis, is that there is an imagined city, and you can create it just as a mental concept. You can run it conceptually over the landscape and do all of the things you need to do without building a single thing. And that seemed to me to be completely legitimate. Not one building that Anya had designed had ever been built. Construction was never the point. She provoked debate. No structure that could be commissioned, she asserted, was worth making. The aim of human existence was to do absolutely nothing gracefully. Any intervention was doomed to make things worse. Architects must learn modesty, how to explain and celebrate what is already there, adapt, revive, invigorate. Putting in a tender was the simplest way of testing your integrity. If you win, tear up your plans, start again, fail better. Well, not long after this book was published, an architectural magazine got in touch with me and said, these are quite interesting, provocative ideas. We would very much like to interview Anya Gree with a photograph for the next issue. I said, well, I'm sorry, I just made up this character. There is no such person. And he said, oh, that's very strange. I met her at a party last week. So out there are these two battling entities for me. There's architecture, and there's an interesting new kind of emerging form of anti-architecture, of post-architecture, of things that are extremely interesting but don't actually exist in the ordinary way, like some of the people in the books. What is the status of the railway line that came from Dalston down to the City of London alongside Liverpool Street, which I used to live, I've been there 40 odd years, and it was still running into the 80s, at which point they told us there was no demand for this railway anymore because people didn't go down to the city for some strange reason, and the real reason being that they wanted to do the Broadgate development, which would obliterate the old stations that were there. And so, under the smoke screen of that, the railway was closed down. So when it disappears, it does become a kind of anti-architectural space, which is extremely interesting. It goes from being something legitimate to something illegitimate, but it has a privileged viewpoint on the city. It runs so high, you can see into all the buildings, you can see relations that are not otherwise available. And I know that my own children and other kids use this space as a kind of magical landscape away from the clutter of what was below, hide out there, trees start to grow up, it becomes its own ecology, it becomes really interesting. It becomes something you might architecturally do, is to put in a kind of green way across the city. But the planting is more authentic. The trees don't just die. It's not kind of compulsory. It's there as this strange entity. And it discovers all sorts of uses, and there are drinkers up there, and there are actually people who are committing street robberies or running away. Whatever it is this landscape, and it's there. And then, of course, now, suddenly it becomes remarkably necessary again to have it back. So at an enormous cost, the thing is reintroduced, having been gone for a certain length of time, which means redoing all of the bridges, means putting in new stations, except that now it can no longer run down to Liverpool Street where it was before, because all that's gone. So it only goes down as far as Shoreditch, and then it goes off. And the link is actually now to Croydon. So Hackney is now twinned with Croydon, that architectural gem on the southern horizon. Very weird times. And today I got an email from a Swedish man called Emmanuel, and I thought this is really interesting because it folds into exactly what I'm talking about. Oh, this other stuff that is happening. He says, my name is Emmanuel, and I'm an artist from Sweden. I lived in Dalston between 2005 and 2009. Last year I started a project called The Rest is Silence. The project is an ongoing attempt to create a myth and history of the 1970s experimental building project, and at the same time to mirror some of the changes that Hackney's gone through in the last 30 years. It all begins in 1978 with a group of people who begin building a structure on a derelict lot in their neighbourhood, and the story ends with the latest wave of gentrification that's going on at the moment. So there were all of these projects, and I noticed some of them on the kind of spaces that would accidentally grow up between terraced houses, where the two gardens stop. You would have a kind of hinterland there, and things would happen. There are the houses like the house in Hackney, which I write about in here. This is a great architectural project, the Mole Man. He's a guy who lived in a very, very large house, and he gave lodging space to students for a time, and they thought kind of odd things were going on. And what it was that he built a concrete igloo in the garden and used it as a cover to excavate beneath, and he started to dig out these tunnels. And he said, well, I thought I'd have a bit of a wine cellar, and then I kept going until there was this enormous, mysterious network of tunnels running deep below the street. So right under the pub, they went miles. And this guy just kept digging and then filling the rooms of the house with the excavated clay. So that the house becomes a kind of mountain of clay, and the underground space becomes his own magic. And of course, this kind of exists, the wall architectural project of a sort, like the Postman Shovel, as was he called, who made these strange towers in France. And yet it couldn't happen. It's not legitimate. It's not allowed in the present landscape, because the attention, the gaze is so intense in a borough where you're on the edge of these grand projects. It's impossible. And what happens is that he's evicted, and the whole thing, is sealed off and closed up, and millions of pounds are talked about. In the same way that a house in the same street where I live, there's a guy called the Owl Man, and he was allowed to squat in this place for about 16 odd years. Nobody cared at all, and what he did, if there were any wild birds were found in the area, they were taken into this house, and the house gradually kind of filled up with wild birds, no broken windows, very strange environment in the middle of a kind of rising gentrified area to have such a thing survive. But it can't survive, and the kind of things he had to do to his house to make this possible can't survive either. You become visible, and then you disappear. And this is a sad thing. And I think it plays out to something I was talking to Jan about earlier in the evening, as to what is the landscape of the failed retail park, the deserted supermarket mall. We haven't got to that in England quite yet. But I was saying this is emerging. This is an interesting landscape that emerges, say, somewhere like down the A13 as you go out of London to the east. You go around Beckton Alp, which is itself a great, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Here is a conical mound, like an earthwork like Silbury Hill, except that it's made from the rubble of Beckton Gasworks, which was demolished, was bombed in the war, later demolished, later used by Stanley Kubrick to restage the Vietnam War, Full Metal Jacket, so that you have a landscape in which authentic damage, rubble from the war, combines with inauthentic damage, rubble from Stanley Kubrick blowing up these buildings as part of the Battle of Hue. Palm trees, he's brought in lorry loads of palm trees from Spain to make this Vietnam. They've died. Plantings done as part of the Alp project, which have also died, because they were about to get Anthony Gormley to put something on top of this mound as a sort of symbol of the A13 becoming sexy and development-ish, and they discovered that you couldn't, because it's 90% arsenic. So it goes, and it's got ghosts of a ski slope and a chalet, and at the bottom of it is this shopping mall kind of zone, which is totally redundant. Woolworths was great there for coffee, but it's gone. So you've got kind of empty Woolworths. You've got pound stretcher type shops. You can't go much lower. So they are gone as cultural contour lines. Beyond them, at Galleon's Reach, is an enormous park with all of the more up-to-date kind of John Lewis-y, whatever, supermarket entities that people go to as a destination. But even those are getting a little bit kind of tired. Kentucky Fried Chicks, all looking. And so as you go down, you're going to have this cultural history of dead retail zones going alongside the scrap yards and the kind of junk places that are there along the river anyway, to the great landfill site at Raynham. Well, when I went down there to investigate, and going down what used to be the northern sewage outfall, which was a raised way that ran from Victoria Park all the way down to Beckton, rather like the railway I'm speaking about, a beautiful kind of ecosystem of its own that gave you a view into everything, but which was converted into something called the Green Way. so that cyclists would use it, and you could boast about all the benefits you were doing without actually costing any money. When you got down there and you found yourself in this new landscape, I saw, looking really depressed, sitting by the river wall, two gentlemen in suits with the plastic accreditation laminated badges and all that, munching very melancholy fashion through a McDonald's burger. And I got into conversation, and they said, well, look, you know, we used to be, our factory is for rendering meat, and it was a very high-tech meat rendering operation, which was put into a building that could have been anything from a hospital to a new university to, you know, some sort of secret state entity. It was one of those gleaming, silvery, low-level things with mounds all around it and new plantings by the river. And that's what it was. And they'd been in Stratford. They had been in what was now the Olympic area. And they had enjoyed it very much. They were part of an actual sort of city centre or town centre with pubs and cafes and all the rest of it. And they'd been expelled and banished. They were told they had to go. They'd been given this brand new premises, but it was nowhere. They said, we've walked for 2 miles in every single direction, and there is nothing except this retail park. And we just cannot eat many more burgers without going stark crazy. So the kind of, what I threw up at the beginning, the idea of edge, where is it? Where is border? Where does it go? Is all part of the process. And these people had obviously hit it. This is the edge. There is no more. You go out, you are in a kind of nowhere. And there were these endless bleak estates growing up as part of the Thames Gateway project, which was dumped because Boris Johnson didn't really want it. You know, it was a Ken Livingstone project. So you've got these kind of severed communities, these abandoned communities out there on the edge of nothing. I guess probably I'm running towards the end of my time. So I'll finish with an actual architect. There's Will Alsop. I met him and interviewed him because he had come up with this notion in the north that fits very much with this idea of the grand project of what he calls SuperCity, which was that you start in Liverpool and you go down the M62 motorway to Hull, and all of that landscape essentially becomes one entity, becomes a kind of city that folds off a motorway. And he made a documentary film about it. And essentially, he's sitting in this sort of four-wheel drive, and he's got his pens, and he doodles on the windscreen like the film of Picasso. And he conjures up little playful buildings that might spread out into this no man's land of this landscape. Again, it's, you know, as an art project, this is quite good fun, and it's entertaining. But the underlying notion that all of this is an entity, all of this can be made into one thing, struck me as being completely crazy. And the craziness of it was borne out when he said to me, well, if, say, people who support Leeds were knocked out of the cup, then it would make very good sense that they just support Manchester United instead. I thought these people would kill each other, that they hate each other 2 miles away. The idea that all this can be incorporated into one thing just by throwing up some playful kind of lollipop-y buildings didn't really hold much water. And the only actual building that he had made, when you came down to it in the whole of this, was the toilet block of something called the Earth Centre at Coningsborough, near Doncaster. And I went to see that. Well, my method of travel to investigate this was to use my Hackney Freedom Pass old person's bus ticket and start at Liverpool and just keep going till I got to Hull. So, obviously I just sort of put my head in the right direction and kept going. And so this was actually 12 changes of bus, but they were all local buses. So every single one brought different voices, brought different anecdotes. People came and talked to us. It was all quite friendly. Took a very long time, and you realized these local differences are very important, and anything you would construct had to take that into the picture. Finally, we got to Coningsborough, and I'll just finish by reading a little bit about that, because it shows What a disaster it is if you actually get the money. Nothing we found along the entire span of this road had actually been built by Alsop. He explained when I visited him in his office that the idea of a super city emerged over a period of time when he was involved with a group called Yorkshire Forward. The man in charge gave me Barnsley. Nobody else wanted it. I was rather hoping to get Scarborough. The M62 became part of my life. If you go by train, it's completely hopeless. I carried his coffee table book with me, the Will Alsop tribute compiled by Kenneth Powell in 2002. There's one surviving Alsop structure to be located, the toilet block of the Earth Centre at Coningsbury, at Doncaster. And it dates from the era when New Labour was still a happy, clappy novelty, rattling out promises without having to deliver. Slush funds milked from millennial lotteries and other addictions inflicted on those who could least afford them were being channeled towards northern areas deemed fit for regeneration. Brownfield anemia doctored with major infusions of fresh green capital. A deal was done, he said, with the National Coal Board to re-landscape the slag heaps. They actually had a vineyard, and it was a perfectly decent hut where you could get something to eat. This was a nice little project, but it was too successful to be left alone. The terrible thing happened. They got the money. I remember when they rang us up, everybody was very excited. They said they were going to give us £50 million. Unbelievable. 50 million stretched elastically, as these things always do, to 80. And it started to get serious, and it started to get visible. Jenny Page was then in charge of the Millennium Commission. You could see why she chose the Earth Centre, because it was green, it was in the north, and it was not in London. A very successful and substantial disaster was snatched from the jaws of a minor local success. In retrospect, it was the worst news we could have had, the granting of lottery funds. The original group lost control, and they were blamed for the failure, but it was not their fault. They never needed that huge amount of money. Our practice designed and built the Millennial Lavatory, and that is my only Millennium project. Arriving in Coningsborough after days on the road and finding no trace of this Earth Centre, I tried the castle. The heritage custodians blazed and bridled all that money down the drain, they reckoned. Potential customers arriving by car at the Eco Park were surcharged £5 a head for wasting fossil fuel. The centre lasted 2 years while they tried to figure out a selling point. A consensus after numerous meetings in motorway hotels on the direction of travel. They offered budget archery for kids. They peddled moral fables like a Victorian Sunday school. The story the castle keepers told us was of carpet-bagging Londoners arriving in the north and given the best jobs in the houses, milking the system and jumping the first train as soon as the plug was pulled. The benefit of the grand project to the community was zilch. The strategy, as Alsop explained it, had been to expound in a vivid, hands-on way the principles of sustainable development. And in a negative fashion, this is exactly what they achieved. They proved that nature sustains itself. It abhors the despoilers of a vacuum. Abandoned mine workings, after a few years left to themselves, have a wild beauty which includes visible traces of all their previous history. Rusted rails, coils of wire, scars and fissures. A totally forgotten Asian security guard, doomed to spend his days invigilating a single surveillance monitor on which nothing happened, very slowly, and wandering step by laboured step around the perimeter fence of what felt like an abandoned Guantanamo Bay, was pleased to have some company. There were derelict guard towers, like the remnants of an execution block, a glass-thatched conical yurt, verdant slag heaps. The Alsop toilets are like stacked containers made from an experimental substance somewhere between metal and human skin. What disaster, the Conradian tourist wondered, had overwhelmed this frontier outpost? Why had the promised highway never arrived? Combining futuristic architecture with poignant memorabilia from a mining past, said the sad notice attached to a skeletal metal tree, a surplus artwork. Here at last was a fitting monument to the super city, a customized wilderness loud with ghosts from a noble industrial heritage, a desolate theme park conceived from embryonic wraiths of a discontinued future, the landscape where reality was declared bankrupt. The glamorously shaggy Will Alsop, painter of windscreens, is our Daniel Boone, a pioneer opening up territory where nobody wants to go, a grand project obsolete before it was launched, the wrong kind of obsolete too, junked prototype, not the soft glow of a kerosene lamp in a cabin in northern Wisconsin, as recalled by the poet Ed Dawn, and not, certainly not, the obsolete status of poetry, the obsolescence that has to be earned, that's been lived through, that sings and that hurts. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Are there questions, comments from the audience? No, perhaps I can ask a question first. You talked about architects being at a split of, you have a choice of either trying to be a star architect or surrendering to this post-architectural production. And I'm wondering if you might have any thoughts of, what architecture should do. Could you say anything about this?
I think I kind of tried to tiptoe around that in what I was saying. I mean, it would be as wrong for me to say what architects should do as it is for the planners and the architects to announce what they are going to do and land on a part of the city that's had no debate or discussion with them. So in a sense, I can't say what an architect should do without myself being an architect. I don't have the complexities of that sort of equation to deal with. I think that they're in a very interesting time, because in a sense they're almost achieving this state which I like of being obsolescent or redundant and therefore having to be something else. Because I think the metaphor I've got that affects me most strongly, I've just been to Athens where I was investigating those incredible Olympic sites where a city and an economy that was going seriously belly up already through all kinds of reasons, landed itself with a €9 billion debt and created along the coastal strip, for example, very extreme and sometimes beautiful objects, Spanish architect, that looked like huge artworks, but the wilderness that surrounds them is total and absolute. And nearby there was new highways that had been built to service this, and there was one old road that had been there before. And in the same way that I was talking about some of the things today, the old road had been taken over completely by joggers and cyclists who were not very visible in the rest of the city. So they had turned a road into a kind of private track and absolutely ignored the space that took millions and millions. All of the buildings, as far as I could see, were totally deserted, apart from the two that had been taken over by football clubs. And so essentially you've got a kind of image of the post-Ballardian madness. And behind it, the buildings were just infill. They really were post-architectural infill. There were lots of these little white things that had just thrown up with no structure or design, not in the classic mode at all, but were just filling space right the way back to the hill. And when you got to the hill, as far as you could see, it was like a glacier in reverse. This kind of development was just shoving its way up the hill as far as it could. So the whole thing struck me as mad, and yet if you were an architect, if you were a kind of, would you be intrigued by taking on one of these projects to create an object which is in complete isolation? And could you convince yourself that it was going to be useful and would have a purpose and it would survive and stand up, or would you prefer to think of something else that you would do that might challenge that concept and talk about other concepts that were more modest? I think that would be the area you were in, where you have a kind of social identity that's very important.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks. I think it's very interesting what you're saying about sort of this term post-architecture. I mean, if the role of the architect is no longer to deal with physical structures, then what of architecture remains? And I think what remains is a sort of an architectural thinking.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I would say that you're perfectly qualified to discuss architecture from that standpoint. I thought it was interesting, Jan, that you used the word should. And I wanted to ask you whether you think there's a certain danger in abandoning, let's call it utopic visions in architecture. And perhaps this is the source of this post-architectural situation.
Well, I did a book some time ago about sort of strange utopias, and I found utopias were generally a good recipe for disaster, but also for interesting disaster. And I was thinking particularly about the borderlands again, the Welsh borderland, where in an incredible, beautiful valley, people were drawn time and again to settle communities, sometimes adapting buildings that were already there, Augustinian Priory and so on, sometimes pastiching them and actually rebuilding them badly, and sometimes making new structures entirely, or sometimes living in teepee villages and squatting entities of some sort or another. And all of these communities, without fail, ended in total meltdown. But so what? You know, in the times that they were there, they did extraordinary things. They were amazing people, and it was a huge attempt to make. And I think I would never say that utopian projects should not be attempted or carried out, but I think they've got a very high probability of disaster.
Hi. Ooh. Thank you, Ian. That was really good. And thank you for invoking the name Charles Olson. I'm sure that hasn't been said in this room for a long time. Right? I think that's very beautiful. I just wanted to ask you something actually methodological, maybe ethical. And I'm wondering whether throughout your prodigious kind of output and prodigious focus on London, but obviously I think you use London probably as a means to talk about more universal things, whether you ever worry or ever feel that you should be worrying that you are you're committing the act of nostalgia. And I'm wondering whether nostalgia, and in your opinion, can nostalgia ever be a kind of force for good? And lastly, is there a difference between nostalgia and what Eric Hobsbawm called the protest against forgetting?
Yeah, I hope so. You know, that's very good. I mean, I think this protest against forgetting is what I would like to achieve, and I think often that curdles into a kind of nostalgia. Maybe not instantly, but if you repeat, which it seems that over a long period of writing, I kind of am hammering at the same themes, and after a length of time, this at its lowest ebb does become a kind of nostalgia, and I'm not worried about it, but I notice it, I'm concerned about it. But that protest against forgetting is really what it's all about. I mean, I don't think I'm protesting change per se. I just do believe that we've got to kind of operate in plural time. We have to have a sense of things moving in both directions. And at the moment, in this sort of fast twitch world, which is kind of changing everything so fast, I think there's a huge dynamic towards obliterating things that are going to hold you back. I mean, I had a really weird experience of chatting to somebody who operates a website. And he said, so I was interested, we're meeting at the Barbican, which is architecturally quite interesting, but he said, when you came here, why did you stop on Bethnal Green Road? I said, what? And he said, well, I've got a Twitter here, and someone said he saw you taking a photograph of a shop doorway in Bethnal Green Road. And somebody else said they sat next to you on the bus. So I realized this kind of surveillance thing of a city is so absolute on Twitter that never mind the 65,000 cameras you've been on all day, that there's actually a kind of record. And so there is no, in that world, there is no past. There's no time for forgetting. Even the photograph I took of some Chinese restaurant doorway in Bethnal Green Road has been sort of snatched into a present before I've managed to question it in terms of the past. So I'm, by technologically being in another age and moving through walking and sort of slow image making and note taking, is already an act of nostalgia. And whether that's legitimate or not, I don't know. Can't tell. I mean, it's sort of probably an end game for me by this stage. I'm stuck with it.
More questions?
Being a local, do you sometimes get visions while, say, walking along the river or Jubilee Greenway of what Lower Lea Valley should be? And do they match? Before London Olympics, did you have something else in mind? And after, maybe something for the aftermath?
Yeah, well, because it's a landscape I haunted. I mean, I discovered it slowly. I lived in this part of London where I've lived from 1968 and gradually shifted out into the landscape. But the luckiest thing I did very early on was getting a job as a labourer loading and unloading containers in a place called Chobham Farm. I took this job. It was one of these agencies in Holborn you could go to get a job any day and go out and work. And they said, would you like to go to Chobham Farm? I said, oh, great. That sounds like, work on a farm, terrific. Well, it was actually a rail yard in Stratford East. And what it was, I didn't know at that time, but what it was that they were getting around dock regulations. It was the moment they were trying to kill off unionization in the docks and move the emptying of containers inland, and they were hiring the lowest possible workforce to carry this out. So while I was working in this place, then I began to explore the Lower Lea Valley. And if you ask, was there a kind of vision that emerged from that? Well, there was, because although I didn't get my Chobham Farm, what I did get were loads of wilderness orchards, things that had been there and become overgrown, houses that had broken down, great mounds of mud, huge cranes, lost rivers that you stumble across and follow. It was rather magical to have that landscape, and to me it was a visionary landscape because you could take a long time to unravel it. And the crossover point in the story for me is interesting, that recently in the book I'm working on now, I came across a Chinese poet called Yang Lian who has been exiled really to live in Stamford Hill in what is essentially a Hasidic community. And he had been thrown out of Beijing at the time of the Olympics there in this sort of tidying up process that I'm describing. And his family had been exiled before this to work on a farm at the time of the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guard. And then his work was thought to be against the spirit of things in the way that, when I was critical of the Olympics, I wasn't allowed to go into a library in Hackney. Well, that was fairly minor compared to being forced to leave the country. Anyway, he arrived in London, and in exactly what you're describing, he's looking for a kind of magical landscape. He walked through Springfield Park down onto the River Lea, and he saw what he recognized as a kind of Chinese landscape with the reed beds. He started to take photographs of this, and he wrote this book called Lea Valley Poems. Well, then imagine his kind of shock and horror when this Chinese landscape he'd recovered, not in China, but in the Lea Valley, becomes the enclosure of the next Olympic Park. So the kind of whole process swept back, and I thought this was both a vision of what had been there, we were talking about what was the vision, and the vision of the future, which is something kind of bleak and strange. I can't see, I won't live long enough to see what is the park become a kind of interesting ruin again. It may thrive and flourish, I don't know. My own sense of it is that there'll be a lot of buildings and a lot of strange walkways and a lot of plants that don't belong dying quietly, and a kind of one of those places that don't feel right because they haven't taken on the past, you know, they haven't gone through the process of not forgetting. That's my instinct.
Would you say that it is possible that this post-architecture you're talking about has kind of acquired its own distinct way of organic growth, one that is different than the fluidity of the city that has been there before, but that one that we have to appreciate for its own worth and values, especially to the contemporary society?
I think so. I haven't really taken its measure yet. I just have a sense that there is this feeling of two branches of the post-architectural world. One is just sort of anonymous and generic and filling gaps, like a kind of dentist that come and throwing up buildings that are not really buildings and don't require an architect. They just require someone who can use a laptop. But then there's another kind of architecture which again splits two ways, like I think that would be well represented here, which is morality, ethics, thinking about what architecture is, really debating its nature, stretching its boundaries, doing all of those things as a process. I think that the doctrine of that is really important. And secondly, people who are doing a kind of scavenging recovery architecture, a kind of unsponsored, interesting architecture, often with the knowledge that it's going to last a certain length of time and be destroyed. And I think if people draw on those ideas, something quite interesting might emerge, because otherwise there's this sort of Gadarene rush of putting up enormous blocks of stuff that are not required, that really aren't wanted, that don't function. I mean, buildings that are being bought from catalogues in Hong Kong, you know, with sight unseen, buy to rent, sort of empty buildings which were being bought by footballers just as kind of investment in the way that Robbie Fowler owns the whole of the north of England. There's strange things go on that are not needed. You know, I've seen on an area I walk every morning a functioning laundry, which is a very real business, an interesting business to watch. You can see these clothes going past on a conveyor belt like ghosts every morning. Click, click, and it's been there forever. It felt, I mean, I suppose it's nostalgic, but it is a functioning building, gone completely, just disappeared to become some, you know, useless entity, just a block of something. A storage block, essentially. You're looking for kind of human storage blocks that cost a huge amount of money and aren't worth it. I mean, I know, you know, my own children who've grown up in this area can't live in it. It would take all of their life to sort of pay off the debts of living somewhere which should be really, you know, in any human society, their right to live in, having grown up in it. And it's not there. It's not a possibility. The freedoms that I had have been lost, even in such a short period. I mean, anybody who wanted to, at that time, could acquire a house. I mean, a house I got cost £2,000. It was going to be demolished, you know, and then the idea changes and the tower blocks fall out of fashion and this thing survives, so you're living there. But I mean, enormous houses were on offer through the council that people didn't want. They didn't want to take on those structures. They preferred to be in a nice modern flat with a bathroom and a tower block. But the city's there. The city, you know, could do it for us without any great difficulty now. But this kind of mindless process is making it impossible, not making it work. What I think what happens here in places like this is that you have the privilege and the information and the intelligence to debate and discuss and come up with solutions. I'm only kind of throwing out half-baked ideas that I've come across in this context of walking through a city and thinking about one small bit. But I mean, they're big questions, and I think, you know, we're going to get to it eventually.
saw, I think it was a poster on the tube actually, that said that if the price of chicken had increased at the same rate as housing in London, a chicken would cost £50 to buy at the supermarket. And my question is sort of like, why haven't we noticed? Why have we just sort of accepted it? It's okay that housing costs so much. We really don't question it. It's fine. It's London. That's how it should be. But then why doesn't a chicken cost £50?
Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely. I think really we have got to question it. But I think the pressures, just the sheer kind of pressure of survival in a city, is so absolute that if people have got somewhere basically to live, they've got it ticking over, they leave it at that. And I think action really will have to be taken. Otherwise, it's all lost.
Maybe one last question from the back.
I had a question about your methodology and if it would be possible to shift that methodology into architecture. It seems as if this methodology pulled somehow from poetry ends with a kind of writing which sits somewhere between reality and fiction so efficiently that it gets blurred to the point that you get phone calls about people that people have met and don't exist. And I wonder if you know an architect or an architecture that has ever managed that level of blurring of reality and fantasy that kind of has managed to put that methodology that you work with into built form.
Not that I know of. No. I mean, only accidentally in how I might look at a building, it might seem to perform that function. In the way, precisely with the building, the nurses' home and the German hospital, it has an authentic history. And I go to this building, it impresses me enormously as I move through the door. And as I move through the door into that space, I'm seeing it in part as the original Bauhaus-influenced, flat-roofed, nice proportioned building, and groping towards the documented history of that. But at the same time, another kind of part of the brain is forced to create narratives, a kind of poetic narrative of the city around the graciousness of this space. So that it's not me doing it. I think all you do as a writer, and it would be the same thing as an architect, is to be able to tune yourself to receive, because we're receivers of the city. It is a kind of seance between the writer, the architect, the painter, whatever, and the space, which is full of so much information, which is full of so many voices, which is full of so many narratives. So there's no originality, really, I don't think. All there is this sort of tuning process in which we allow ourselves to be ventriloquized by various stories and create some artifact. So the only hassle, in my point of view, is to go through, and this is the equivalent of a building. This is a kind of architectural shape. I negotiate. And in words, this is becoming more and more difficult because I've talked quite a bit to various students at Oxford and Cambridge, and they do not do this architecture. The ones who were writing about me had never read a single one of my books. They had never been able to navigate through it. What they did was they downloaded bits of interviews and sort of junk that's floating around in cyberspace, and they saw films, and they kind of saw films of films, and they, out of this strange world, created an impression. And in the same way, they were quite convinced that the Olympic Park was, as the virtual version videos out there, that it was a landscape of blue water and forests, and the buildings were already built, it was all done. And the stuff I was telling them was crazy. It's like some madman wandering about in the desert. So in that sense, I think we're collaborators, and there's no difference in essence between the architect, who is no longer this sort of engineer, mechanic, and the writer, who is no longer simply a hack producing material that goes through a process of publication and whose only job is to build up a brand name. I don't think so.
Hello. Ian, thank you for delivering such a fruitful first public occasion AT event. Just like to point out that Charlotte from the AA Bookshop will have copies of the newly published paperback version of Hackney That Rose Red Empire for sale for special price, and Ian might be available for signatures. Thank you all very much for coming.